El tono quizá de la sesión de hoy va a ser un poquito más complejo que el de ayer, sobre todo para los que no vengan del campo filosófico, entonces siéntanse completamente libres en cualquier momento de interrumpir y decir hay algo que no entiendo o puedes repetir esto para tratar de que la conversación al final sea un poquito más fructífera.
I'm not sure if anybody watches Deadwood in Spain. The second reference may be obscure, I'm not sure. Okay, I'm going to do this the same as I did last night, but hopefully talk for a little bit less time than I did last night by running through some main points. I might read some text in the middle where it gets philosophically a little bit harder, but we'll see how it goes. The point of these two epigrams is to indicate the period of time over which, if you like, this structure of the new, reflection on the concept of the new, has in some way the basic concept through which to understand history in modernity has been going on. In other words, over 200 years, at least. So, I was going to talk about less things tonight, but perhaps in slightly more detail. Firstly, some general points about the new as a philosophical concept. Then the main part will compare two different traditions of thinking the new, which have their origin in the mid-19th century, but which continue in a way to this day. The opposition within European critical theory, in many ways between a German and a French tradition, is a modified version of the opposition between two 19th century German traditions, really, the Hegelian and the Nietzschean. So the question of how to think the new in contemporary critical theory is really an opposition in many ways. The clearest opposition is an opposition between Adorno and Deleuze, and that opposition is a kind of modified repetition of the 19th century difference between Hegelian and Nietzschean concepts of the new. And then I'm just going to end with some brief remarks about how one might distribute the insights of these two competing traditions across some more unitary understanding of the new. And so basically what I'm going to suggest is that each tradition is focusing on one aspect of the temporality of the new. I'm going to try and explain what that means. But first of all, the new is a philosophical concept. For some, the idea that a concept like the new is a philosophical concept is contentious, but I take it that both the Hegelian and the Nietzschean traditions, insofar as their philosophies of modernity, are in a certain sense alternative attempts to theorize the concept of the new. That's primarily because I take the new to be the essential, the sort of basic temporal core of the concept of the modern. Right? In other words, if we understand the modern in its most basic historical meaning as a temporal concept, in other words, that which is of today as opposed to yesterday and which is valued for its difference from the past, then the concept of the new, or the idea of that which is a temporally emergent, or in some way in opposition to the past, is, if you like, the core meaning of the modern. So I'm going to treat the new as the temporal core of the meaning of the modern. And in particular, I want to think about modernity and modernism as historical concepts within the terms of a philosophical thinking of the new, which means that modernity and modernism are basically, in their most general sense, categories of the philosophy of history. That's the essential framework that I want to impose. And they're categories of the philosophy of history insofar as the philosophy of history has its, if you like, its high point, its high philosophical high watermark of the philosophy of history. If we take that to be Hegel's thinking of history as a totalized, an ongoing totalizable narrative, and we understand, if you like, the standard criticism of Hegel's philosophy of history to be that it's teleological, that it projects an end, that ultimately, and this criticism goes back to the 1830s with Feuerbach, that essentially that there's something in the Hegelian concept of the absolute which essentially ends up negating history, so that Hegel becomes, in a sense, both the first and the last philosopher of history. He both, if you like, founds the philosophy of history as a core philosophical genre, but he also exhausts it in a way. This concept of the absolute exhausts the concept of history. So in the same way that in the history of philosophy, Kant's abiding significance really resides in the fact that he's both, if you like, the first philosopher of the subject, the concept of the subject, and also the first philosopher to most fundamentally critique the concept of the subject, so that the philosophy of the subject kind of emerges and is simultaneously consumed in Kant, in different aspects of Kant. So I would say that the same thing really happens with the category of history in Hegel. History becomes a fully blown philosophical concept for the first time, but it in a certain sense exhausts itself in the moment of its, if you like, fullest articulation. And the idea of modernity as a philosophical concept is really the consequence of Hegel's founding but exhaustion of the philosophy of history. Insofar as if we, as most people after Hegel did, accept the criticism that the Hegelian philosophy of history is marred by this teleological projection of an end, that it has the end of history implicit within it, and that the end of history has the end of time implicit within it, then what you're left with, if you like, after the critique of Hegel's philosophy of history, if you take Hegel's philosophy of history and you subtract the problematic elements, namely the teleological endpoint and the absolutization of time, essentially what you're left with is the formal structure of the dialectical development of time. Yeah, and essentially what modernity as a philosophical category is essentially formed by this abstraction or subtraction of the pure form of temporal development from Hegel's philosophy of history. So it's Hegel's philosophy of history without an end, as pure temporal formalism. And the pure temporal formalism of dialectical development is, if you like, the attempt to logically schematize essentially the production of the new through the negation of the old, right? And that's basically the temporal structure of modernity. So if I presuppose that the new is a philosophical concept, and I presuppose that after Hegel, that modernity is, if you like, the largest scale version of the new as a philosophical concept. It posits the new as the basic temporality of history, as a formal structure, a formal structure and an operation, which is, if you like, the operation of the constant production of the new through some kind of pure temporal formalism. And insofar as there's a kind of categorical distinction between the notion of modernity as a basic category of history and the notion of modernism, it is essentially that modernism as an ism, simply semantically by virtue of its character as an ism, and this is true of all isms, refers to some kind of collective affirmation of the modern, right? In other words, I take all categories of ism, whether it's modernism, surrealism, constructivism, all isms. What the ism as a category does is to denote some kind of collective affirmation. So modernism is a collective affirmation of the new. And if modernism in its multiple forms, if each modernism is a particular collective affirmation of the new, and if the new refers to this pure temporal logic of negation, of the production of novelty through time, then that means that the core philosophical meaning of modernism as a philosophical category is that it's the collective affirmation of a temporal structure of negation. And this is what's, if you like, distinctive and formally apparently contradictory about modernism, is that all modernisms are affirmations of negations. Right? So the question of the philosophical understanding of modernism consequently comes down to the question of how philosophically you understand the relationship between affirmation and negation. Right? Because modernism contains both affirmation and negation within itself. Right? To be a modernist is to affirm a certain kind of negation. Yeah. And so philosophically, what I'm calling the new, and when I refer to the new here, I don't mean some particular thing which is new. I don't mean an example of the new. I mean the new, qua the new as like a pure temporal structure or a temporal logic. Yeah. Every new is some form of affirmation of a negation. So the issue is going to be what's the relation between those two things. But before I go on and talk about the way that Hegel and Nietzsche think that relation differently, because they both think affirmation and negation, but they think them like asymmetrically. Oh, that's gone off. Why has that gone off? Doesn't matter. No, I think it's all right. It's gone back on. Something odd has happened to that. Hegel is going to think affirmation from the standpoint of negation, and Nietzsche is going to think negation from the standpoint of affirmation. And the question is really going to be what's the difference between that way, thinking them that way round, one from the standpoint of the other, which are they going to become ultimately equivalent, or is there some fundamental difference? But before I do that, I just want to talk about three sort of paradoxical aspects of the concept of the new, which is the consequence of the fact that it's formed philosophically by this subtraction or this abstraction of temporal form from a narrative of dialectical development, right, which is this abstraction of the time of dialectical development from the idea of a teleological end. And the three things that distinguish the new in this respect are abstraction, iteration, and what I'm going to call nihilism, and they're related, and together they pose the problem of the new. If you like, the paradox or the contradiction of the new is that because of the level of abstraction at which it's constituted, the concept is constituted, it has a tendency, if you like, to appear as the same. Right, so that there's a tendency of, I'll explain this in a moment, there's a tendency of the new, if you like, to turn into its opposite, which is the same. And the reason for this becoming the same of the new is this combination of abstraction and iteration or repetition, if you like, of the new, and the consequence of this becoming the same of the new is essentially nihilism. Yeah, and insofar as one wants to think of fashion, if you like, as a distinctive form of the new, which is different from the kind of historical form of the new that I want to try and talk about. Fashion as a mode of the new is, if you like, is tied to this nihilistic, abstract repetition of the new as the same, insofar as the novelty of fashion is indifferent to the question of qualitative historical novelty. Fashion, if you like, is a repetition of the new at a lower level of time consciousness. It has a much faster and increasingly, if you like, rapid rate of reproduction. And insofar as it does that, it represents this separating off or kind of self-alienation of the formal quality of pure newness from any determinate historical content. And so at the level of the understanding of contemporary art, there's a kind of critical competition between the time consciousness of historical novelty and the time consciousness of fashion. Yeah. And in a way, one of the most difficult critical tasks, in some way, tasks for a critic, is to be able to, if you like, critically disengage these two forms of newness or these two forms of novelty and the two forms of temporality which are associated with these two forms of novelty in relation to particular works. Yeah? In other words, to be able to tell when something that's new is new in a genuine, historically qualitative way, whether it's fashionable or not, because it might also be fashionable, or whether something that is presenting itself as being historically new is in fact just fashionable. And that question, which is absolutely central and difficult critical question for art criticism, is to do with, if you like, the level at which the negation which is being affirmed by the identification of some novelty is constituted. In other words, what is being negated? Is that which is being negated something which has only a passing, temporary historical existence? Or is it something, if you like, that has a much longer temporality? Yeah. So the question of the historical novelty of some new art is essentially parasitic on the question of the kind and the duration of the temporality of the thing that's being negated. Yeah. And that's one of the main issues. But of course, there's also the other side, which is, if you like, the more Nietzschean side, which is the question of the force of its affirmation, the extent to which what is negated as a consequence of some particularly powerful affirmative force, or whether the affirmation of the negation is the consequence of the power of the negation. And these are the two philosophical alternatives. So just to rerun these three concepts: abstraction, iteration, and the ever same. It's because the concept of the new is constituted in abstraction from any particular instance of the new, that the new appears as a pure temporal form. And it's because the new appears as a pure temporal form that when it repeats itself as a structure, when it has a structure of repetition to it, there is, if you like, there is an indifference between, at a certain level of abstraction, there's an indifference between the novelty of each new thing. In other words, each new thing, insofar as it is new, each new thing qua new, is the same as new. Insofar as you abstract its newness, which is the, if you like, the modernist affirmation is to try and abstract the pure newness. The more you abstract the pure newness, in some sense, the less novelty you have, and the more you're simply repeating the structure of newness itself. But the structure of newness itself is the same in each instance. So this is the paradox. And it's connected to nihilism insofar as an increasing self-consciousness of the paradox of the logic of the new imposing a kind of homogenizing temporal formalism is an increasing lack of belief, if you like, in the determinate content of any particular new thing. Since the reason within the culture of modernism that it's being valued is because of its novelty, and novelty in each instance as novelty is the same, there's, if you like, there's a progressive withdrawal of meaning from things that are new. There's a kind of seepage of meaning. The more the logic of the temporal formalism of the new imposes itself, if you like, the harder it is to value novelty. And that's, if you like, that's the nihilistic moment. And that's obviously going to feed into the way in which Nietzsche is going to understand the affirmation in modernism and try to, in some way, save the novelty of the new through affirmation, to save it from the structure of repetition, which is imposed by the notion of negation, by the idea that the new is always a negation of something old. That's going to be Nietzsche's attempt. Where are we? Okay, so we have two traditions, the Hegelian and the Deleuzian tradition. And in contemporary European philosophy, they're represented by Adorno and Deleuze. I happen to have these cartoons of Adorno and Deleuze because when I had to do a debate with my colleague Eric Aliès, who's a Deleuzian, we had to do a public debate in an art context. And when we arrived, we discovered that they'd produced these two cartoons and they put these huge pictures above our heads. So we were subjected to debating underneath these comic figures. But they're quite good because the Adorno one really conveys something of the anxiety of negation and the anxiety involved in trying to sustain the tradition of negation under conditions in which it appears to be, if you like, turning into the same. And indeed, it's Adorno in aesthetic theory who famously says, the famous quotation is, "The new, insofar as it is the ever same, represses duration." Right? This is Adorno's famous remark. The new represses duration, and the new represses duration because of the structure of repetition. So Adorno is extremely anxious, and obviously something bad is happening under the table that he's sitting at. But whereas Deleuze, in his more Nietzschean mode, is extremely relaxed and embracing the deathly character of his cigarette. So he represents affirmation. Okay, I'm going to read a short part of this, as it's a bit more formal, and then I'll come back to talking more broadly. So the central philosophical issue, as I've said, is how does the affirmation of the new stand in relation to its negation of the old? And the two main traditions here, the Hegelian and the Nietzschean, are defined by their differences on that question. How does affirmation relate to negation? So that broadly speaking, in the first instance, that's the Hegelian one, there's an understanding of temporal negation as a negation within which what is affirmed, namely the new, is affirmed through negation, versus a conception of temporal negation, which is the Nietzschean one, when negation is itself a mode of being of affirmation. And this is the difficult thing in the way to understand about Nietzsche. For Nietzsche, negation is a particular mode of being of affirmation. Yeah, essentially, I'll come back to this, but essentially for Nietzsche, negation is the mode of being of the affirmation of destruction. Yeah, that's the way of, if you like, escaping a Hegelian logical notion of negation, is to conceive of negation as the consequence of the affirmation of destruction. Yeah. More specifically, in the first case, the temporal negation constitutive of the affirmation of the new, as I've said, is the result of the subtracting the form of dialectical development from the systematic context that makes such development, turns it in Hegel into a progressive definition of the whole or the absolute, and hence ultimately a supersession or an extinction ultimately of finitude. Now this, if you like, this abstraction of the temporal form of negation may look as if it's simply an abstraction of method from history. It's not the purely abstraction of a method, however, because what saves this, if you like, the philosophy of post-Hegelian philosophy of modernity from being methodological, is that this abstraction of a pure form of time is understood as the structure of experience of a specific subject, right? And this is the subject, if you like, the subject of metropolitan modernity, or more broadly, the subject of capital. So when I don't know if anybody actually watches Deadwood in this room, but has anyone seen Deadwood? This is a completely obscure reference then. In this quotation, when Al Swearinger, who is somebody who runs a brothel in Deadwood, sees this character called George Hurst coming down the road and says, "Here comes the new." It's because George Hurst represents the new, because he represents the arrival of capital. This is a series essentially about the development of capitalism in America and the sort of destructive, the violence that was a condition of the emergence of capitalism. And George Hurst is the new because George Hurst essentially is capital, right? And this connects to the post-Hegelian philosophy of modernity, insofar as modernity can only function as a category of the philosophy of history rather than as a pure formal methodological category, insofar as there is a specific subject to its structure. Yeah. In other words, the subject to the structure of the development of the absolute in Hegel, is Geist, world spirit. Okay, so if you get rid of that, because that's the objection to Hegelianism, what's left? What's the subject of the structure of the experience of pure temporal development? And the answer is basically subjects of metropolitan modernity, or, if you like, more basically subjects of exchange relations. Subjects that are made as subjects by being subjected to the logic of capital as expanded accumulation. And expanded accumulation is the basic, if you like, social form of the new. So this notion of modernity as a category in the philosophy of history is underlaid by the presumption that there is a specific subject of experience, and it's the subject of capitalist societies, it's the subject of exchange relations. And the reason that such a subject is subjected to the logic of the new in its most basic form is because it's subjected to exchange relations, and exchange relations are governed by the logic of expanded accumulation. And it's if you like, it's the self-expansion of capital, which is the model, if you like, for the social model for the production of the new. So on its Hegelian coding, this subject, the subject of metropolitan modernity, displays the immanent self-transcendent characteristics of dialectical development in general, in which affirmation is the ultimate meaning of negation. So if we look to the discussion of affirmation rather than negation in Hegel's logic, we find the following, and this is, I apologize for the slight difficulty of this quotation. It's a quotation from Hegel's logic, and it reads as follows: the highest form of nothing for itself would be freedom. Yeah. But this is negativity insofar as it deepens itself to its highest intensity and is thus its self-affirmation. Yeah. And you see, Hegel, it does it every time. A quotation from Hegel's logic. It's a room emptier. Indeed, and then the quotation ends, indeed, absolute affirmation. So what's going on in this this passage from Hegel's logic is the passage in which he demonstrates that for Hegel, yeah, it's the intensification of negativity which produces affirmation. Yeah, because the absolutization of negativity, yeah, pure negativity, and a negativity which is unencumbered by any positivity at all, is freedom. Yeah, and insofar as such a negativity is freedom, such a negativity takes the form of an absolute affirmation. Yeah, it's a difficult but important idea, if you like. It's the moment in Hegel's logic in which negation turns into affirmation, and that consequently affirmation is revealed to be, if you like, the highest form or the highest meaning of negativity, or negativity as freedom. Yeah, this is important because what it means is that from a Hegelian point of view, you know, insofar as modernism is this collective affirmation of the new, yeah, modernism as a cultural form is, if you like, equivalent to freedom, because modernism as a cultural form is the point at which, if you like, negativity frees itself through its destructive capacity. Negativity frees itself from positivity and as such becomes affirmation. Yeah. So that's the way in which the modern is an affirmation of a negation, is that it's negation itself turning into affirmation as freedom. In a way. And that's the basic kind of modernist core of Hegel's philosophy. Insofar as Hegel is a modernist philosophy, it's because he tries to logically demonstrate that the absolutization of negativity as freedom is affirmation. Yeah. So if you take this passage from the logic, it's the passage, if you like, in which you could say retrospectively that, if you like, Nietzsche is produced by Hegel inside his own logic. Yeah. The point at which negativity as absolute and hence as freedom turns into affirmation is the strange moment, the strange climax, in a way, of Hegel's dialectical logic, in which Hegel's own dialectic turns into Nietzsche. Yeah. Because the point at which negativity has been absolutized as freedom, it becomes what Hegel calls absolute affirmation. So it's sort of become Nietzschean in a strange way. So from this perspective, the modernist affirmation of the new is understood as an enactment of the affirmative essence of negativity itself. This for itselfness of the new, which is absolute affirmation, is of course then itself the prospective starting point for new negations. So just as, if you like, in Hegel's logic, you ultimately get the transformation of negation into affirmation, that moment of production, of affirmation itself, if you like, then produces, the affirmation that it produces a new positivity, which then itself has to be negated, and then you go back to the beginning of the process. Okay, so which is why there's this cycle of repetition. And what's important about this is it means that the intensification of the experience of novelty ultimately comes to depend upon the anticipation of the death of the thing that's new, right? So in modernist culture, once modernism becomes, if you like, self-conscious of itself as a process which repeats itself, that each new becomes old and each new will be negated by a new, yeah? It comes to anticipate. It acquires a kind of melancholy quality because it comes to anticipate the antiquarian or the antiquated character of the new before it's even been produced as new. Yeah. So as the culture of modernism becomes more self-conscious of its own logic, by the time something emerges as new, it's already, if you like, in the shadow of its own prospective death. Yeah, and this is the point. The point at which the temporal logic acquires that self-consciousness is the point at which modernism emerges formally as a cultural concept. In Baudelaire's definition of modernity in terms of the transient, the fugitive, and the contingent, because this is the point, if you like, at which it's not just the production of the new which is affirmed, but it's the logic of the production of the new which is affirmed. It's no longer anything particularly new, which is at issue. It's the pure experience of the production of the new and its ceasing to be new, its transitoriness, the contingency of its becoming old, something else becoming new. So insofar as one takes a Baudelairean definition of modernism as the transitory, the fugitive, and the contingent, okay, that's, if you like, the point of self-consciousness of this temporal process. Furthermore, this temporal process has the structure of what Hegel calls a bad infinity, or a spurious or a negative infinity. And the bad infinity, to which you can always add one, right? This endless process. Is one defined by Hegel in terms of this, like, repetition of the logic of the new. He defines the bad infinity as, quote, something becomes another, but the other is itself a something, so it likewise becomes another, and so on ad infinitum. It's the same logic. Something becomes new, the new becomes old. It's replaced by something which makes it old, etc., ad infinitum. And from Hegel's point of view, of course, this is like a profound defect. The endless quality of the temporal logic of the modern is a profound philosophical defect, because it can't grasp, if you like, it doesn't achieve its any ultimate philosophical self-comprehension. It can't, if you like, stabilize itself as a knowledge. And of course, that's why Hegel, if you like, rejects romanticism in his aesthetics, precisely because of this quality of spurious infinity which is associated with, and the idea that, if you like, that romanticism represents a subjectively interpretive contingency, is what Hegel says about it. So there's if you like, there's a kind of imminent transition from a Hegelian to a Nietzschean standpoint about the new in two ways. The first, as I've said, is through the turning into the affirmation of negation. But the second is also is this self-recognition of this process itself as a kind of emptying out, as a process of emptying out, becoming increasingly abstract, in which the future becomes a void, essentially, which is the problem of nihilism. And it's this point at which the future becomes a void, which is, if you like, taken up and embraced by Nietzsche, not so much as a problem, but as a condition which has to be overcome from within. So whereas on the one hand we can find, if you like, one philosophical version of the concept of the new as a negation that turns into an affirmation, based on Hegel, we find the beginnings of a second one in Nietzsche in the Untimely Meditations, and it's really in the second Untimely Meditation on the uses and abuses of history that you get the beginning of the second tradition, the non-Hegelian tradition. But in the second Untimely Meditation, it's a challenge to the historical culture of modernity. The second Untimely Meditation on behalf of modernity itself, and it does so in the name of life. And essentially, the Nietzschean move is to take the notion of absolute affirmation, which Hegel has produced through the notion of freedom, and to rename it life, and in renaming it life, to kind of ontologically generalize the force of the modern. And one of the things that happens in the move in terms of philosophies of the new and philosophies of modernism from Hegel to Nietzsche is that the new ceases to be merely, if you like, a category of a philosophy of the subject, something which is generated by negation and destruction, which is always the act of a subject, and becomes ontologically generalized and becomes a feature of life in general. But of course, life in Nietzsche is not a biological category; it's a metaphysical category. So in Nietzsche, life is simply the name in the second meditation. Life is the name of whatever is able to forget and thereby to act. Yeah. And one of the senses in which Nietzsche represents an intensification of this abstraction of the culture of modernism is because this notion of forgetting, the idea that, if you like, forgetting is a condition of acting, intensifies the kind of anti-historical element of this logic of the new. Yeah. Because for Nietzsche, forgetting and acting are essentially unhistorical powers. So what happens essentially in the Nietzsche is that basically Baudelaire's notion of modernism as the experience of the beauty of the feeling of time, which is really what modernism boils down to in Baudelaire. It's an experience of a pure temporal experience, but it's experience of time as itself beauty. Yeah. The Kantian notion of beauty is reduced to the temporal dimension of the subject's relation to itself. This notion of beauty as the feeling of time becomes beauty as the feeling of life. Insofar in Nietzsche, there's a kind of equivalence between time and life. And this is already there to a certain extent in Kant, insofar as the whole of the aesthetic faculty in Kant is based on what he calls the feeling of life, the Lebensgefühle. Yeah. There's a quote here from Kant, not as difficult as the Hegel quote, which reveals the kind of proto-Nietzschean elements of Kant's aesthetics when he's talking about this notion of the feeling of life which underlies all aesthetic experience, where he says, "It cannot be denied that all representations in us, whether they're objectively sensible or intellectual, affect the feeling of life, and none of them, insofar as it is a modification of the subject, can be indifferent, because the mind for itself is entirely life, the principle of life itself." So that there's a kind of Lebensphilosophy, there's a kind of life, proto-Nietzschean life philosophy already underlying Kant's aesthetics, but it's not, in Kant himself, and certainly in 19th century neo-Kantianism, it's repressed. And in a way what Nietzsche does is he extracts this sort of ontological core of Kant's aesthetics, which is this feeling of life, and generalizes it and subjects it to this notion of the new, this notion of the modern as the temporal experience of the new. So Nietzsche's philosophical modernism is aesthetic in a manner that the dialectical tradition is not. In other words, the tradition which wants to separate affirmation off from a logic of negation is aesthetic in a way associated at the time with the work of art. Hence the famous phrase from the second untimely meditation where Nietzsche says, only if history can be transformed into a work of art, will it perhaps be able to preserve instincts and evoke them. So history for Nietzsche, subjected to the unhistorical power of acting and forgetting, can endure only, if you like, as art. But this notion of this intensification of modernism, if you like, whereby the structure of repetition of time leads to a kind of forgetting, to a kind of anesthetization, in a certain sense, of the subject, a kind of historical anesthetization, is still sort of ambivalently connected to the historical culture of modernism in the second untimely meditation. It's only in the later Nietzsche, and thus spoke Zarathustra, that the temporalizing self-reflection that exceeds Hegel's absolute reflection on history is itself absolutized. And it's almost as if Nietzsche is, if you like, formally responding, which he isn't because he couldn't have known about it, to Rimbaud's 1873 imperative, which is the imperative to be absolutely modern. And in absolutizing this power of forgetting, Nietzsche absolutizes affirmation. And when Nietzsche absolutizes affirmation, he tries to cut it off from any logical notion of negation. And it's the absolutization of affirmation in Nietzsche which, if you like, transforms life first into the will to power, and then in the late notebooks as well into the idea of force, where the notion of will is, if you like, subjected ontologically to the notion of force, so that the notion of force becomes the basic concept, and life is understood simply as the inner will of force. So force becomes the kind of guiding metaphysical concept. And in this process, the dialectical account of the relation of affirmation to negation, that's to say the production of affirmation out of negation, gets inverted. Because if, as it is for Nietzsche, if everything is affirmation, the difference between negation and affirmation becomes internal to affirmation itself. This is the basic Nietzschean Deleuzian position. As the difference between, on the one hand, a reactive or nihilistic affirmation of negation, which is dialectics. Dialectics is, if you like, the nihilistic affirmation of negation, and an active affirmation, which is an affirmation of affirmation, or what in the will to power is the will to will, which is transvaluation. And transvaluation is, if you like, the highest point of the, if you like, this alternative modernist absolutization of affirmation. So an active or secondary affirmation converts negation into itself an affirmative power. And this is the trick, if you like, in Nietzsche. So I'm just going to read what I think is the most condensed account of this. It's a quotation from the last part of Deleuze's book on Nietzsche, where he tries to sum up this sort of consumption of negation by affirmation, the way that Nietzsche attempts to, in some sense, just as Hegel's logic ends up deriving a Nietzschean position from a negation, so Nietzsche tries to sort of consume negation inside affirmation. And the quote reads as follows: "The negative becomes a power of affirming. It's subordinated to affirmation and passes into the service of an excess of life. So negation is no longer the form under which life conserves everything that is reactive, but becomes, on the contrary, the act by which it sacrifices its reactive forms. As to say, a self-destructive act In the man who wants to perish, or the man who wants to be overcome, negation changes sense. Only affirmation exists as an independent power. The negative shoots out from it like lightning, but is also absorbed in it, disappearing into it like soluble fire. In the man who wants to perish, the negative announces the superhuman, but only affirmation produces what the negative announces. And this is the key sentence, I think, in Deleuze's understanding, reading of Nietzsche as a modernist philosopher, as a kind of anti-Hegelian modernist philosopher. Only affirmation produces what the negative announces. And basically what I want to suggest is that this distinction between production and announcement is essentially a distinction between, if you like, two different standpoints on the relationship between negation and affirmation. Yeah. To put it another way, from Nietzsche's point of view, what Hegel gives an account of as the production of the new, namely the dialectical logic of negation, is actually only, if you like, the representation of that, or the representation of its intelligibility in relation to the old, and that actually it's affirmation which is producing, if you like, what the dialectic is merely announcing. Yeah. So there's a sense in which, from the Nietzschean point of view, dialectics is incorporated into this affirmative notion of the new, but as the moment of, if you like, retrospective understanding. Dialectics allows you to understand afterwards the meaning of the new in relation to the old. But according to Nietzsche, it misunderstands itself as the logic of the production of the new. Yeah. And that's really the dispute between them. So it's not a simple dispute between two different models. It's a dispute over, if you like, what it is that produces the new, and whether that production is different from its understanding. And essentially, the Hegelian model insists that the way that the new is produced and the way that the new is understood is the same, essentially. Yeah. Whereas the Nietzschean model insists, in some sense, that affirmation, as a kind of purely creative act, yeah, produces the new, and that production, that kind of ontological production of the new, is on the Nietzschean model what I'm calling here a pure event, right? That has it's an internal intelligibility qua event. It's not produced as meaning. It's produced as new, and meaning is, if you like, a retroactive effect of the new which has been produced. Yeah. So if you think of this in relation to artistic production, then, or you think of it in the traditional way, it's something like the Nietzschean account of affirmation as the production of the new is something like what Kant called the nonsense of pure genius. Yeah. In other words, in Kant, if you have genius without taste, it's nonsense. Yeah. Because it's so original, it's so purely new that it's unintelligible. Yeah. So that in Kant, pure genius is nonsense. And you need, on Kant's model, relatively conservative model, you need genius tempered by taste. But on this model, it's not that you have genius tempered by taste, it's that the distinction between genius and genius with taste is the distinction between the production of the new in its, if you like, pure eventfulness and its inherent unintelligibility. In other words, on the Nietzschean model, the new is in some sense inherently purely unintelligible at the moment of its production as novelty, because it's a pure affirmation. It simply, if you like, exists as the affect of a force. Yeah. The intelligibility, or if you like, the taste, the understanding to which this genius must be subjected in order to be intelligible, is not a different form of production, but is, if you like, the retrospective consequence of putting what has been produced into relation with other things. Yeah. Okay. So this is, if you like, quite a profoundly romantic model of artistic production, which is then tempered by the idea that the meaning of what is produced will then always be a retroactive effect of putting it in relation. Yeah. So that there's a strong distinction here, in a way, in Nietzsche, and a valorization of artistic production over reception, and in particular, a separation of production from critical intelligibility, really. And the distinction, in a way, between the ultimate distinction between the Hegelian and the Nietzschean positions, and which is reproduced in a way within the art world, between those who hang on to the idea of the possibility of a critical art, and people who think that the notion of a critical art is, in a way, no longer sustainable, is the distinction between, if you like, whether critical discourse is a recovery of the conditions of production, as I was talking about last night. The romantic model in this sense is allied to the Hegelian one, whereby the putting of a new work in relation to an old work is not merely a retroactive production of intelligibility, but is actually tells you something about the logic of the production of the work. Since from the Hegelian point of view, it's the negation of the old which produces the new. And the Nietzschean position, which, if you like, wants to affirm the pure affirmation of the artist, wants to, in some sense, absolutize the standpoint of the artist in opposition to the critic, yeah, and make the new produced, and then leave the question of its intelligibility to a secondary question, and furthermore to conceive the question of its intelligibility as, in some sense, a reactive or a weak question. Yeah, because, if you like, the ontological power of the new on the Nietzschean model resides with the force of its production, and the, if you like, the intelligibility or the desire to understand the novelty of what has been produced as new through its relation to the old is, if you like, a culturally, if you like, weak and reactive, because an old preserving effect. Because just as, if you like, it's through its negation of the old that the new has meaning in the Hegelian tradition, it's as a consequence of the new being defined in relation to the old that the old is taken up and continued within modernism, right? In other words, modernism needs tradition and the new needs the old as that which is negated in order to render it different from it. So that there's a sense in which, that from a Nietzschean standpoint of a Nietzschean modernism, a Hegelian modernism is always dragging the past along with it in order to have a point of difference through which it can, if you like, mark its own novelty. Yeah. And so, despite presenting itself as new, it's in some way also, even in its very newness, it has this conservative or preserving function of the dialectic, whereby the old must be carried into the future as that which has been negated. Yeah. And that's the sense. If you like, that's the Hegelian meaning of the museum within modernist culture. Right? The museum must preserve the old, because without the preservation of the old, we can't understand the novelty of the new from a Hegelian point of view. Yeah. So it's, if you like, it's the museum which gives meaning to the contemporary art gallery from a Hegelian point of view. Yeah. It's the museum in its traditional conserving function that allows the contemporary art gallery to be contemporary, to be new, through its difference from it. And it's that relational difference which appears, if you like, still too backward-looking from a kind of purely Nietzschean point of view, because from a purely Nietzschean point of view, that is, if you like, to mortgage the forward-looking direction of the new. It's to mortgage the future-oriented character of the new to its difference from the old. And the pure model of affirmation would be one would be one in which you would try and, if you like, think the future through the purely affirmed new without regard to the old at all. Right? Okay. It would be one which would refuse all relational determinations. Yeah. So what this means in terms of, if you like, the critical culture of this kind of Deleuzean Nietzscheanism is it means, if you like, that the new must be valued for the affect of its force alone. Yeah. And the problem with valuing the new from the point of view of the affect of its force alone is that it looks very much like, and this happens to Deleuze in an Anglo-American context, it's in danger of becoming a kind of intensified revival of aesthetics, which is the discourse of pure pleasure, right? The discourse of pleasure as opposed to the discourse of intelligibility or the discourse of truth in criticism, because the affect, if you like, the affect of the force of the new is just, if you like, the Nietzschean version, in a way, of aesthetic experience. Right? So the thing that seems most, if you like, radically differentiating precisely by virtue of its refusal to think relationally is in danger, of being a kind of self-disavowing return to aesthetics. Yeah, and that's the problem for the Nietzschean point of view. But I think maybe I'll stop there, because I think this has been quite hard, and I think, yeah, that just sums up the question of the this association of becoming with production and being with retrospection. Yeah. Shall I stop there? Yeah, I'll stop there. That's enough. I think it's a bit harder tonight. Maybe. So maybe we stop.
Bueno, quizás ha sido un poco más densa la charla de hoy. Pero bueno, por lo menos en mi opinión, con un final que un tanto simplificador, lo cual espero que algo haya sido precisamente inteligible. ¿Tienen preguntas preparadas? ¿O? Me adelanto entonces yo de entrada. Mi pregunta un poco se aferraba a esta última parte, pero también tratando de relacionarla con la sesión de ayer. Y un poco conociendo a Peter, supongo que adelanto ya la respuesta, o sea que es casi una pregunta de conveniencia, pero me parecía que había algo de subterráneo en esta diferencia entre esta posición o esta visión completamente afirmativa de lo que es lo nuevo y otra negativa, asociada básicamente con Adorno, ¿no? Según el cartoon que veíamos ahora. Y de manera casi lateral parecería que entender lo nuevo como pura afirmación en relación al estado de la crítica del que hablábamos ayer podría resultar particularmente conveniente. Es decir, en el sentido de que, si valoras una obra de arte desde el punto de vista de que el artista ha creado algo literalmente ininteligible por su mera novedad, la necesidad de un aparataje crítico pasa a segundo plano, ¿no? En otro sentido también hablaba ahora del museo y por supuesto si hay algo que diferencia a los precisamente llamados nuevos museos es su carácter de acontecimiento cada vez más. Bueno, en las bienales pues por supuesto es una especie de reemplazo del museo qua historia acumulada por el acontecimiento en sí. Entonces, no sé si había una intención por parte de Peter de insinuar un cierto ponerse de moda de la afirmación convenientemente, ¿no? Dentro de un sistema institucional que quizá se presta más a ello. I was just saying, in relation to the talk yesterday as well,
Yeah.
and the sort of last bit of your talk today, I mean, I maybe I can sort of guess the answer, but you know, this sort of valorization of affirmation, you know, might seem, you know, when one sort of remembers or sort of thinks back to the description you made of the sort of critical status right now, you know, it might seem a sort of very sort of convenient thing to sort of hold on to when you're sort of, you know, you have a sort of weekend criticism, because, you know, you just, you know, in a way you remain speechless, you know, in the face of nonsense or unintelligibility. But also, I mean, I was interested as well when you sort of bring the museum into it, because of course the museum is no longer or kind of less so a historical apparatus and rather a sort of machine for producing events. And in that sense, is, you know, I was wondering if you have something to say about the sort of apparent convenience of affirmation as opposed to.
Well, you mean the performative turn in curation?
Well, I don't call it such a thing, but you can.
I don't know. I mean, I think, you know, in relation to the question, the problem of criticism and the question of affirmation, you can look at it in different ways. I mean, you can look at it partly as those who believe in the kind of, who adopt the Nietzschean Deleuzean position, which I don't, but you can see it as an attempt to come to terms philosophically with what they perceive to be a situation in which, if you like, there is no historical logic to artistic production. So it's a kind of philosophical absolutization of the perception that there is no longer a historical logic to art production. The question is whether it's really true that there's no longer a historical logic to art production, or whether it's merely, if you like, the decline of a critical culture of constituting the historical intelligibility of work. But I mean, in that sense, I don't know, it's not so much that it's convenient, it's more willed, I think, than being convenient. I think it's more of an attempt to philosophically redeem the perception that there is no longer a detectable historical intelligibility. But that's partly the consequence of confusions over values, insofar as market values are separate from critical values. So I'm not sure about that. As for the museum, I don't know. I mean, I think this performative, this event quality in curation is obviously connected institutionally to museums. But I think that the museum function of museums is in some way remains unaffected by this performative turn in a way. Because the performative turn is just is an attempt to, if you like, you know, update them as cultural institutions, but they're still museums as opposed to, I mean, there are different art institutions, but insofar as they're still museums, they're still defined by their pastness and their, you know, however frantically they try to perform contemporaneity in a way, all they can do is perform that difference between the present and the past. So I'm not so sure about this. I think it's not clear that museums have ceased to, if you like, produce that point of difference. I don't know about that. I don't know what other people think about that.
¿Alguien? ¿Sí? Ajá. Is it on? Is it working?
I can hear you.
Yeah,
so
well,
just
say it.
speak.
Yeah, I'll translate it into Spanish. If I...
Okay, so I have two related questions. Going back to some of your initial comments about philosophy of history that's stayed or to some extent assumed. So the first one is really with Hegel. If you evacuate the content of its teleology from Hegel's philosophy of history, then in what sense is modernity a dialectical development? I mean, I can see how you can see it's dialectical in the sense of dialectic having used for the sect, which is a dialectic, it might not be a Hegel dialectic. But in what sense is that a development? What is the criteria of development? It could just as well be a dialectic of sameness, sort of sameness and flux. So the question is, where's the promise of development?
Okay, yeah.
And the problem being that the promise cannot come from the new, because the new is already internal to dialectical development. So I guess my worry, concern, is that on this model, modernist new becomes an exception, according to which capitalist modernity perpetually returns. Okay.
Yeah.
So now you get the translation. Yeah. So.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
No. Let me. Can I finish my question?
Yeah. Sorry,
Yeah.
I thought you finished because you said.
No, I haven't. No, I just got sort of lost. But yes, according to this dialectical development, whether capitalist modernity returns, and I'm assuming that capitalist modernity is a problem here. I had a second question, but maybe it was just about your quote from Hegel's logic, and that you didn't make a distinction between positive and negative freedom. And it's the same point, really, which is that in Hegel's quotes, you could see the sort of an absolute negativity as a totality of negation in terms of positive freedom, rather than singular negations as negative freedom. So it's the same, sort of logically, it's the same sort of problem that the modernist new becomes, is only a negative freedom, politically sort of either liberal or anarchist, but not post-Hegelian.
Uh-huh. Okay, la traduzco rápidamente al español. Decía que tenía dos preguntas relacionadas, que la primera se refería a las observaciones de Peter al principio sobre la filosofía de la historia de Hegel. El problema de él era que si le quitamos a Hegel la teleología, esa idea de que la historia va hacia algún punto en concreto, que ya sabemos cuál es, ¿en qué sentido se podía pensar en esta dialéctica de lo nuevo como un desarrollo dialéctico? Se podría pensar en esto como dialéctica, desde una dialéctica de lo nuevo y de lo mismo, quizá una dialéctica no hegeliana, pero difícilmente como un desarrollo, porque ¿en qué sentido habría un desarrollo? Es decir, o sea, ¿de dónde obtienes tu promesa de desarrollo cuando no tienes ninguna teleología, es decir, ningún fin al fin, ¿no? O sea, no vas hacia ninguna parte, por lo cual esta promesa es difícil de localizar. Tampoco podría venir de lo nuevo, dado que lo nuevo ya es interno a esta misma dialéctica. Y apuntaba a la posibilidad de que esta dialéctica de lo nuevo, lejos de ser bueno, una dialéctica hegeliana vaciada, no fuera otra cosa que una eternidad capitalista. Y luego también apuntaba otra cosa respecto a la cita de Hegel en la lógica, cuando decía esto de que la negación de la negación era libertad absoluta. Bueno, apuntaba que en Hegel hay una diferencia entre libertad positiva y negativa. Y que, bueno, esto... You haven't sort of gone on to explain what negative and sort of positive freedom is, but maybe this is something that we leave to Peter. Y en ese sentido, bueno, lo que tendríamos con el modelo nuevo sería una negación singular que nos devolvería lo que Hegel llama una libertad negativa y que se relacionaría básicamente con una postura quizá liberal o anarquista, pero difícilmente hegeliana.
Yeah, I don't think I disagree. I think that's the problem. In other words, insofar as modernity as a category of the philosophy of history is constituted by this abstraction, then it has the problem of its sameness and its eternal repetition within it, right? That problem doesn't go away. But that doesn't mean that it's not developmental. It can't be construed as being developmental, but it can only be construed as being developmental, not from the standpoint of an absolute end, but from the constantly reconstructed standpoint of a present, right? So that there's a constant, and this is, if you like, the function of criticism, there's a constant attempt to construct historical intelligibility. You constantly have to, if you like, construct the intelligibility of the present as a negation of the past, right? And insofar as you can do that, then you can, construct it developmentally. If you have a concept of development that means that you need an absolute end, then it's not developmental. But insofar as, if you like, the logical form of this development is the bad infinity, yeah, then it's the logic of infinite approximation. So you have an end, but the end is a regulative idea. It's not an actual end. So you still have a direction and a development, but it's one which is contingent on your capacity to, in the present, to construct its historical intelligibility as a dialectical negation of the past. Right? And that capacity doesn't, however successfully or otherwise you can perform that capacity critically, yeah, it doesn't take away the threat of the formal structure of the new, making all development look as if it's all just development within the development of something which is fundamentally the same. Yeah. Because that's the case. I mean, all social development internal to capitalist societies remains capitalistic from the standpoint of the distinction between capitalism and non-capitalism. Yeah. It's an eternal repetition of the same, okay? It's an eternal repetition of the value form. But from the standpoint of the more particular developments, the more particular characteristics of different societies, it's a development. And the same with the history of art, right? The question is whether at particular points and from particular standpoints, it's possible to construct the intelligibility of the present as a kind of totalizing negation of the past. Yeah. In other words, what makes Greenberg the last of the kind of hegemonic critics was that he was able to narrate a history of art, right, which allowed the present, his present of basically the 40s and 50s, right, of formalist modernism to present itself as the continual ongoing negation of the whole of the history of art. Right? He could totalize the history of art. He had a narrative, right, which allowed him to totalize the history of art and present new work successively as a negation of that. Okay? Now that broke down at a particular point in the 60s because suddenly there was all this new kind of post-formalist work, and it was all post-formalist in a different way. Yeah? And it was all multiple. And there didn't seem to be a standpoint from which you could, if you like, totalize the art of the past and present the art of the present as a negation of that art of the past. I mean, you could do it formally, but it was formalistic. So that, to begin with, the main critical category after Greenberg, if you go back and read the criticism of 64, 65, 66, there's lots of, there's a kind of chaos of categories. It's what Smithson called it, the avalanche of categories, this kind of sudden production of new categories. But the basic critical category was post-formalism. Yeah. And that was, if you like, a purely formal way of totalizing the present's relation to the past. And what happened, interestingly, was that the category which briefly became critically hegemonic as the category which would embrace all the plurality of completely different negations of modernism became postmodernism, right? In other words, there are strong logical reasons connected to the hegemony of Greenberg as to why postmodernism, if you like, which is now, if you like, a redundant critical category, became for 20 years or so the primary critical category through which people thought the multiplicity of things that came after to modernism, because it was the one way of totalizing that multiplicity of new forms of art in a unity which opposed it, which negated the old, which was modernism. Yeah. So that there was a kind of logical inevitability to the category of postmodernism, given that there wasn't another standpoint from which to totalize current art's negation of old art. Yeah. But the problem with the category of postmodernism, like the category of postformalism, which it replaced, was that it's a purely formal category. Yeah, there's no determinacy to the negation. So at the point at which people start, in the last 15 years or so, you get a lot of revisionist historiography of the art of the 60s. And one of the things that's most interesting about that revisionist historiography is the most critically serious coming out of the revisionist historiography is always trying to take a particular aspect or a particular art practice from the late 50s onwards and use it as the standpoint from which to totalize the negation of modernism. Yeah. So you get different people doing it in different ways, and it's convincing or not in different ways. So, Hal Foster, for example, for a period tried to use minimalism, wanted to say, minimalism was the category through which you could unify art after modernism. Yeah. Because if you like, minimalism had sufficient, once the category was developed in a particular way, you could find minimalist aspects in enough art practice to make minimalism the post-formalist category. In my own book on conceptual art, I argue that in fact it's not minimalism isn't kind of categorially basic enough to do it, and that in fact it's the concept of conceptual art that does it, right? But equally, other people have argued that the performative argument, the idea that, if you like, it's not the negation of aesthetic by concept, it's the negation of aesthetic by act. Yeah, and so in a way, there's quite a big critical issue and quite a lot of debate in many ways about which of those categories is more universal and can, if you like, function more critically as a negation of the previous art. And in other words, is performance essentially functioning negatively in its conceptual components? So is performance, if you like, a subjugated? Is it a sub practice of? Is it a subtype of conceptual practice? Yeah. Or is what people thought of as conceptual practice a subtype of a performance practice? And that's a big philosophical and critical debate. The whole I mean, not just performance and curatorial, but performance studies, the whole attempt to take philosophical concepts of generalized philosophical concepts of the performative, Judith Butler type concepts of the performative, are categories which, if you like, allow you to try to do that. Yeah. So they're categories which take a small critical category and ontologically generalize it to the point at which it offers you a certain level of universality through which you can negate the past. So that the question of, if you like, where does the positivity come from, is to do with it's not just, the question of negation is not just to do with what you're negating, it's to do with the mode of your negation. And the mode of your negation is the question, if you like, of your affirmation, of what you're affirming along with negation. When what it is you affirm in order to affirm negation. Yeah. So if you think of, if you like, performance and conceptual art as alternative negations of an aesthetic concept of the art object, or alternative negations of the notion of an aesthetic object, a sensuous object, yeah, then they're both, they both negate the aesthetic, but they affirm different things in order to negate it. They affirm their negation of the aesthetic by affirming different things. So that there is always a positivity in these negations. And if you like, the question of what, which category wins out is it's a historical issue in many ways. And the revisionist historiography of the 60s is the site, it produces the material over which people are fighting in a way, or are trying to recode and reconceive in order to do that. I don't know if I've fully answered your question, but I've partly answered it.
Me ha parecido muy interesante la relación que has mostrado respecto al surgimiento de la modernidad con dos disciplinas muy importantes, como sería la filosofía de la historia y la estética. Al respecto, valdría la pena repensar cómo la misma noción de modernidad, por ejemplo en castellano o en inglés, modernity, señalan una temporalidad distinta a la anterior, que por ejemplo en otro idioma como en alemán sí señala lo que has apuntado, por ejemplo en Sattelzeit como tiempo de lo nuevo. Lo interesante es que la modernidad como concepto filosófico surge gracias a un debate previo que es la famosa querella entre antiguos y modernos. Tanto la estética como la filosofía de la historia la retoman. Y al momento de retomarla, esto genera una nueva temporalidad, una nueva forma de acercarse al pasado. ¿No será entonces que en tanto modernos estamos condenados, esa es mi pregunta, a retomar nuevamente esa querella, que esa querella no la podemos evitar entre lo antiguo y lo moderno, que es algo desde el horizonte de la modernidad, desde el horizonte de una nueva temporalidad, siempre inevitable?
No, well, he was saying that he found it really interesting, and just how you trace this sort of emergence of the concept of modernity, both from, in the philosophy of history and in aesthetics. And he pointed out the sort of difference in meaning in the concept of modernity when that's, in Spanish, which had a very precise meaning, which you don't elaborate, but it's sort of different from the German one. And then sort of tracing back to the sort of earlier querelle des anciens et modernes, the sort of the battle of the moderns and the ancients, and how what he asked is that when you take up this conceptually this concept, are you not as moderns, are we not condemned to sort of constantly renew this sort of battle between the ancients and the moderns, and isn't there some kind of inevitability in them?
Yeah, I mean, just two things. The thing about the linguistic thing, I mean, it's more of a French meaning, really. It's more of a Baudelarian modernity. I mean, the German word that grasps this concept isn't really Modernitat, which is a kind of Germanization of a French word. It's Neuzeit. The German tradition is Neuzeit. So it's actually the concept is, in the German tradition, the concept is semantically tied to the notion of new time rather than modern. I mean, this is, my perspective is, if you like, German in the sense that it takes that conceptual track and rereads the notion of the modern, which is that, that Baudelarian tradition, from the conceptual standpoint of the notion of Neuzeit, which is more explicitly a category in the philosophy of history because it's more explicitly a periodizing category at the end of, it's a semantic emergence at the end of the 18th century because it's tied, the notion of new time is it's a periodizing notion that emerges in relation to the geographical notion of the new world, right? In terms of the colonial concept of a new world, so that it's closer to history. But in terms of this question of this eternal, I mean, there is something eternal about it. Yeah, I mean, the formal structure has an endlessness. Yeah, it is eternal. I mean, that's why in Nietzsche the concept, I mean, I didn't read that part of it, but that's why in Nietzsche the concept of the intensification or the absolutization of this notion of affirmation is associated with the notion of eternal return, right? Because what's being affirmed is the structure of repetition, right? What you're affirming when you're not affirming, when you're subjugating negation to affirmation, produces this eternalizing effect. But I mean, my argument is that's, if you like, that's one side or one aspect of this temporal structure. And despite the fact that that's the case, nonetheless, every time you get a particular instantiation of a particular cycle, a particular negation, a particular affirmation of that negation, and hence a particular affirmation of something which it is that makes the negation, you have a determinacy. And that's, if you like, the residual power of the Hegelian tradition, is in deriving meaning from determinacy and determinacy from negation. Yeah, I mean, the problem for the Nietzschean tradition is that you're left with affect and forces. Right? You have no meaning. That there's something, for the late Nietzsche, there's something inherently reactive about meaning. Yeah, there's something, existentially, ontologically weak about meaning. And in that sense, there is a kind of performative contradiction in the work of, someone like Deleuze in his more Nietzschean moments, in the end of the Nietzsche book, and then in some of his more Nietzschean formulations, because Deleuze was in some sense, such a traditional philosopher, such a recoverer and reconstructor of the meaning of the history of philosophy. Right? There's something slightly disingenuous about this ontological dismissal of meaning as a kind of weak reactive force. When the whole of Deleuze is, if you like, constituted by meaning. It's a work of meaning. It's a work of meaning that, that in a sense so performatively values a certain kind of intellectual labor that to treat that as, merely reactive and weak in relation to some abstractly determined absolutization of affirmation looks kind of gestural, really. If you really adopt the Nietzschean position, you just don't write books about the history of philosophy, right? I mean, it's like it's a kind of pointless task.
My question has to do with it's very simple. The first question is, do you believe that contemporary art still works with the dialectics of new, old, new? Because for me, what is more distinctive of the difference between the contemporary, and I say contemporary as opposed to postmodern, because it's contemporary as a historical notion as opposed to a temporal notion. So to use contemporary means that you're not working exactly in opposition to modernity or to modernism. So one of the differences that I think it's more strong in contemporary art is that it relates to the past and doesn't refuse it, or it doesn't, for me, or as I think, it doesn't go with the same logic of as the new opposed to the old. So in this respect, I think contemporary exactly works like this, because there's no unifying, as you said, no unifying universal category, neither new or old to oppose to, because there's a kind of explosion of categories. So there's no one category, which would make it even difficult to think in a post-conceptual category as equal to contemporary. Or what do you think about?
Has that been translated?
It's been translated, isn't it? So, yeah. Sorry.
The question of the contemporary is like a whole new, it's a whole new question. But firstly, it is absolutely a temporal notion. Yeah, I think it's completely a temporal notion. What the contemporary draws attention to is a kind of internal complexity to the logic of the modern, if you like, the logic of the new, which is what's inherent, what's semantically inherent in the notion of the contemporary, is the idea of a coming together of different times, is the idea of, if you like, a plurality of temporalities within the present. Yeah. So the contemporary defines the present as a kind of unity of multiple and disjunctive temporalities. Yeah. And that makes the question of temporal relations more complicated, but it doesn't necessarily help you escape, if you like, the logic of the modern and the logic of the new in terms of its relation to the past. Because insofar as the contemporary wants to posit a kind of, there's a kind of positivism of the present about the way the notion of the contemporary is used, right? As if the contemporary were merely the collection of things that coexisted, right, within, classically within the life of a particular subject, right? Okay, I mean, in terms of the history of the notion of the contemporary, things are contemporary if they come together within a single life, right? So your contemporaries are people who are alive with you at the same time. They're people who went to school with you. They're your contemporaries, right? Well, artworks have their own contemporaries. Artworks are contemporaries if they're, if you like, produced in the same time. The problem with the notion of contemporary is that it's not a critical category as such, because it's content for them to just sort of live together, to inhabit the same present in some sense. But the critical question posed by, the logic of the new, is really whether they are inhabiting the same historical present or not. Because they're mere kind of chronological coexistence, right? And so, you can think of contemporary art as a general uncritical category. Contemporary art just denotes a kind of empirical coexistence of art objects in the same chronological time. Yeah. If you want to turn it into a critical category, then you have to say, well, the works of art, these works which are all coexisting empirically in the same time, the ones that are going to be critically contemporary, are going to be the works which mark the time of the unity of these works within themselves, as a specific temporality of the present. They're going to, if you like, they're going to have to be works that mark, if you like, the time that they share, rather than just being, as if they're laid indifferently alongside each other, which obviously, from the point of view of the market, they are laid indifferently alongside each other. From the point of view of the market, they must each appear individually in order that they can enter into exchange relations and be preferred or not preferred. But from the point of view of criticism, there's the question of, if you like, well, what is the time of the work? And when you ask that critical question of contemporary art, lots of art which empirically coexists with other art in the same time, which is the time of our life, doesn't really turn out to be very contemporary. Because in some sense, it fails to mark what is distinctive about the time of our present, in which it happens to be inhabiting along with these other works. And when you start to ask the question, well, what does it mean to do that? Then the question of the new starts to re-emerge, and the contemporary becomes something like the presence of the new. So I don't think that you can. I don't think that there's an escape from these problems through the notion of the contemporary, but there is a rendering of them more complicated. In particular, because the notion of the contemporary, because it brings together different times, it also brings together the times. These different times are times of different spaces, so that the contemporary is a much more spatially distributive term than the modern. I mean, the modern, in a sense, is an attempt to abstract time from space. Right, to treat time as a pure formalism abstracted from space, whereas the notion of the contemporary, because it's a unity of disjunctive times, has a reference to space and has a reference to, in particular, kind of globality, which is ineliminable. So things get a bit more complicated, but I think the contemporary is a complication of some of these logics rather than an escape. But then,
¿Hay alguna pregunta más? ¿No? Ok. Bueno, pues si les parece bien, entonces lo dejamos aquí. Les recuerdo también, para los que tengan interés, a lo mejor de revisitar las ideas con un poco más de detenimiento, y también por parte de Peter un poco más de carne, si queréis, que el libro esperamos que esté realmente en 2 o 3 semanas, esperamos ya tenerlo disponible. Hay 2 capítulos del libro colgados en la página web del SENDEAC, bajo licencia de Creative Commons, que podéis consultar. El primero, que es el arte más allá de la estética, y el segundo, que se llama Los modernismos y las mediaciones. Les da un poco una idea de lo que es el resto del libro en todos sus gloriosos 22 capítulos, pero bueno, les recomiendo que en principio los comenten y tal. Pues muchísimas gracias por venir. También les recuerdo que Jean-Louis Deot va a venir a mediados de noviembre. Para los que le a los que le interese Peter, yo creo que también va a ser una persona bastante útil. Ha hablado muchísimo sobre Benjamin, de hecho el seminario se centrará un poco en una como reactualización de algunas teorías benjaminianas y bueno, solamente comunicárselos y hasta la próxima. Muchas gracias. Gracias.